Today, we're diving into one of the most legendary last stands in human history. And trust me, this guy deserves the title of the ultimate wingman. Meet Benkei. It's the 12th century in Japan. Kyoto is dotted with temples, monks strolling around, doing monk stuff. But Benkei, he's not your average serene, meditative monk. Nope. At 6 feet 6 inches, wielding a nagata, a terrifying mix of sword and spear, he looks less like he's seeking enlightenment and more like he's auditioning for Gladiator. Kyoto Edition. Benkei isn't just tall. He's a warrior monk, battle-hardened and highly trained. And he has a problem with samurai, more specifically, their ego. Over the years, he decided the world would be better with fewer arrogant samurai. So he set a goal: defeat 1,000 samurai. He collects their blades as trophies, and after countless duels, he's up to 999. Just one more to go. One fateful night, near Goto Tenin Shrine, Benkei hears the faint sound of a flute. Curious, he peers around and spots a small, wiry samurai with a shiny golden katana. Jackpot! The perfect final sword. Benkei, brimming with confidence, challenges him to a duel. And then, he loses. Immediately. Completely. Humiliatingly. The small samurai doesn't even kill him. He just turns and walks away. Benkei is left standing there, trying to remember how gravity works. He's 6 feet 6 inches, covered in scars from hundreds of duels. And somehow, a tiny guy just humbled him. Benkei stews. He plots revenge at Kion Mudera Temple, hiding, waiting, scheming. Eventually, the samurai shows up again. Benkei challenges him again, and loses. Again. Ouch. At this point, most people would consider changing careers. But Benkei, he bows in defeat and says, "Fine, I'll follow you as your retainer." That samurai, of course, is Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a legend of the Minamoto clan. And just like that, Benkei becomes the ultimate wingman. Benkei and Yoshitsune fight together in the Genpei War against the powerful Taira clan. 5 years of epic battles later, the Minamoto clan emerges victorious. Yoshitsune's half-brother, Yoritomo, becomes shogun. Sounds like a happy ending, right? Wrong. Sibling rivalry kicks in, jealousy rises, and Benkei and Yoshitsune find themselves on the run, hunted by Yoritomo's men. They take refuge with the Fujiwara clan for a few peaceful years, but eventually betrayal strikes. On June 15th, 1189, at the Battle of Kuromwa, Benkei and Yoshitsune are trapped. 500 Fujiwara soldiers surround them, and this is where Benkei becomes a one-man army. He takes the bridge leading to their castle and becomes basically unstoppable. He slashes through wave after wave of enemies. Some legends say he killed 300 men on that bridge alone. Archers fire volley after volley of arrows at him. And guess what? Nothing. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't move. He's basically a walking do not disturb sign for death. Time stretches. Both sides stare at each other, unsure who will make the first move. Finally, Fujiwara sends a few soldiers forward, and when they reach him, they find Benkei standing there. Already dead. Yes. He died standing. Why? Because he wanted to give Yoshitsune enough time to commit seppuku and maintain his honor. He positioned himself with his spear to give the illusion of being alive, ensuring the enemy wouldn't cross until it was too late. That, my friends, is the ultimate wingman move. Benkei sacrificed everything, not for glory, not for himself, but for his friend. Benkei died standing tall so his buddy could go out in style. And somehow that makes him the most epic wingman in human history. The end of the 16th century in Korea was complicated. Imagine a world of political corruption so thick you could slice it with a sword. Yet for the average citizen, life was relatively calm. Korea was a loyal tribute state to China, and for the most part, the Ming dynasty didn't bother them. To the east, the Japanese were preoccupied with slaughtering each other in the Sengoku Jidai, so they weren't exactly knocking on Korea's door. And then, there were the persistent Yurshin raiders from the north. But aside from those annoyances, Korea was pretty uneventful. This peaceful no-war life had a side effect. Most ambitious men became scholars or government officials. That was the ticket to power, prestige, and influence. Unfortunately, this created a bloated, corrupt political class and a military that had never really seen combat. Generals were essentially armchair warriors. They had the rank, the uniform, and the ego, but none of the experience. This combination of corruption and military weakness would soon become Korea's nightmare. In 1590, Hideyoshi Toyotomi finally realized the ambitions of his late lord, Oda Nobunaga. Japan was unified for the first time in over a century, and if the Japanese weren't busy fighting each other, well, who were they going to fight next? Of course, they looked at Korea. Toyotomi sent messengers demanding Korean support for his plan to conquer China, or else. Remember, Korea was basically the Puerto Rico of China's at this time. They couldn't help Japan conquer anything, and frankly, they didn't want to. They thought the Japanese were primitive barbarians, and to be honest, they weren't wrong. Plus, these guys couldn't sail worth a damn. In 1592, hundreds of Japanese ships appeared off the coast of Busan. This was not a trading mission. This was an invasion. And Korea's top admirals? Well, two of them panicked so hard, they sank their own ships to avoid fighting. Just like that, half of Korea's naval fleet vanished, voluntarily. The Japanese landed unopposed and began conquering forts and cities on their way to Seoul. The Korean military, inexperienced and demoralized, was no match for Toyotomi's veterans. Casualties mounted. The Japanese were merciless, leaving few survivors. Within 3 weeks, Seoul fell. Weeks later, Pyongyang was in Japanese hands, and their forces were practically at China's doorstep. Korea seemed doomed, but then, a man rose to challenge fate. A man who would become Korea's greatest naval hero. His name? Yun Shin. Yun Shin wasn't your typical beloved hero. In fact, the elites kind of hated him, and for all the wrong reasons. Early in his career, he was so good at inspiring his men and winning battles that he made everyone else look bad. Jealousy is a powerful weapon, and the corrupt generals struck first. One falsely accused Yi of deserting in battle. The king, trusting the lies, stripped him of rank, threw him in prison, and tortured him. Most men would have quit. Most men would have given up. But Yi, he clawed his way back, eventually commanding a small fleet by the time the Japanese invaded. Despite Korea's disastrous start, they had one advantage. Years of dealing with Woku pirates had forced them to innovate. They built Panoxion ships, and later the Turtle Ship, floating fortresses, bristling with cannons, designed to resist boarding. Japanese ships, on the other hand, were mostly transport vessels, equipped for boarding actions, swords, and spears. At sea, the Koreans had the edge, but only if someone competent was leading them. Enter Admiral Yi. Unlike the cowardly admirals who scuttled their fleets, Yi led 34 ships straight into the Japanese and attacked along the coast. His skill as a naval commander was evident immediately. Using clever tactics to lure the Japanese into vulnerable positions, he sank over 200 enemy ships in just a few weeks, without losing a single Korean vessel. Battle after battle, he was outnumbered, outgunned, and still sailed away victorious. Yi was the glittering jewel in the mess that was the Korean Navy. By year's end, he had sunk 350 Japanese ships, and with Chinese reinforcements, Korea pushed the Japanese all the way back to Busan. Peace talks began, a temporary stalemate emerged, and for a moment, hope returned. But not everyone liked Yi's success. Remember the two admirals who sank their own ships at the war's start? One of them, Wang Gun, was insanely jealous. When Toyotomi launched a second invasion in 1597, Gun and other officials framed Yi as a traitor. The king, once again, stripped him of rank and imprisoned him. Brutal torture followed. Yi was spared execution, only to be sent back to the battlefield as a common soldier, a humiliation worse than death. With Yi sidelined, Wang Gun commanded the Korean fleet. Predictably, he was a disaster. He drank, disrespected his men, and made poor tactical decisions. Veteran commanders refused to fight under him. Meanwhile, the Japanese learned from their previous defeats, built better ships, and adopted Yi's tactics against Korea. This all culminated in the Battle of Chilchon. Gun led 200 ships, including Yi's former top men, into a trap. The result? Complete annihilation. Gun was last seen fleeing, only to be cut to pieces by Japanese soldiers. The king, realizing his catastrophic error, reinstated Yun Shin. Yi took command of a shattered navy, just 13 ships and a few hundred demoralized sailors. But he didn't hesitate. Using superior strategy and tactics, he sank 31 out of 333 Japanese ships in the next battle, again without losing a single ship. This gave him the time to rebuild his navy, though the odds remained grim. Then, fate intervened. Hideyoshi Toyotomi died in 1598, ordering a full Japanese withdrawal from Korea. Yi seized the opportunity for a final offensive, targeting the retreating Japanese fleet at the decisive Battle of Noryang. At the helm of his flagship, Yi stood with his son and nephew, beating a war drum to rally the allied Korean-Chinese fleet. He personally sank 10 Japanese ships in the opening assault. Victory was within reach, but then tragedy struck. A musket ball pierced Yi's armpit, a mortal wound. Fully aware of his fate, he turned to his son and nephew. The war's at its height. Wear my armor, beat my war drums. Do not announce my death. Obeying their father and uncle, they carried his body below deck. His nephew, dressed in Yi's armor, resumed the drum, keeping morale high. His men fought on, unaware of their leader's death, and Korea drove the Japanese out, completely undefeated in battle. Yi died below deck, listening to the sound of his drum, knowing his homeland was finally free. Yun Shin, the admiral who could not be broken, whose genius at sea turned hopeless odds into victory, and who sacrificed his own life in the ultimate act of leadership.